Let's take a look at this automated deployment. I'm going to skip the git push method of deployment and save you the pain of watching me write shell scripts, as well as the pain of me actually having to write shell scripts. I'll also skip the npm publish and install method, and we'll just look at my favorite method, and that is using gulp and Candyman for deploying directly to the device. I'm going to go ahead and jump back to Visual Studio. We're looking at Visual Studio 2015 RC, and this is with the Node.js tools for Visual Studio installed. So we already talked about those. Those are the tools that you can find on, let's just go ahead and jump out there on github.com on the Microsoft repo, and it's the Node.js tools repository. Go here and scroll down a little bit, go ahead and get those downloaded and installed, and you're going to be up and running with the same exact environment that I'm working in. Now once you have those tools installed, you can follow along and do File, New, Project, and under the JavaScript section you get Node.js. This is great, this is very robust. There are a lot of different project templates. We're going to choose the blank Node.js console application. That's plenty for us. And we'll go ahead and hit OK. Now it doesn't really matter what the logic for our app is. So in our app.js file, let's just go ahead and leave console log hello world. That's just the simplest app in the whole world. Now what we want to look at here is getting this code, whatever it might be, to our device in an automated fashion. So we're going to use gulp. Now there are a couple things that you need to do to get started with gulp. I'm going to go ahead and jump to the console, so I can just hit Windows 3 and that opens my PowerShell console, brings me right to my prompt, and I'm going to type in here that I want to do an npm install with a -g, that means global, gulp. Now I'm not going to run this on mine because I've already got it installed, but you'll go ahead and execute that command. It'll run through the installation of gulp and all of its dependencies. And then in your project, you need to install gulp locally. So it needs to be installed both locally and globally. So I'm going to go into this console application, into the specific project file. And this is where that app.js and that package.json file are. So this is where I want to install gulp. So I'm going to do an npm install of gulp. But I'm going to say --save--dev. Now what this flag means is I want to install gulp, but this is really just a development dependency. I don't need this whenever my app goes into production. So it's important to add that dev flag on there, the --save_dev flag. Now what this actually does is it writes into the package.json file. So when this is finished, I'm going to type out the package.json file, and you're going to see that a line has been added to it. Not only has that line been added to the package.json file, but we've also actually got the installation of gulp. So here's that installation file. Let me try that again. Gulp at version 3.8.11 or newer. So let's go ahead and jump back into Visual Studio. Now I've done the two things, that is I've installed gulp globally and I've installed gulp locally. So I want to get started with working with a gulp file. And to do that, I'm going to right click on my project and add a new item. There are a lot of different templates for things. This is really just a blank JavaScript file. So and it's called gulp file. So I'm going to make a new JavaScript file called gulpfile.js. Then I'm going to go ahead and click add. Gulp file.js appears. There's not too much that needs to happen in here just for a default. I'm going to go ahead and bring in the gulp dependency, which is as simple as requiring gulp. So that's there. And then I'm going to write just a real basic gulp file. I'm going to say gulp task, and I'm going to call this one default. And then I get to write a function. And this is the simplest gulp file. Okay, now this function is going to execute, so let's go ahead and give it a body. I want this body to be, let me first go ahead and end this properly. I want this body to be a simple console log that we are running the default gulp task. There we go. Okay, now I've saved that gulpfile.js file, and this should be ready to go. So I can jump back to my console. You'll find that with Node.js applications, you may, if you work with the same workflow as I do, you'll jump back and forth between your IDE and your console quite a bit. Now, the dev tools, the Node.js tools for Visual Studio, do make it quite nice to be able to manage some things right here in the GUI, in the graphical user interface, but I tend to jump out to the command line and do it that way. So here at the command line, I should be able to just type gulp, and what that knows to do is to execute this default task. So we'll say gulp, enter, and if we've done everything right, we should get running the default gulp task right there. Okay, so that's working as expected, but let's write something that actually does what we want, and that is copies our code out. So let's make another task. We'll call this deploy, and we want this to deploy our code. Well, how do we get started deploying code from here? What we actually need to do is execute some commands at the console, either locally or remotely. Now, there are a number of packages that allow us to execute SSH commands, SCP commands, but I've wrapped that all up in a module that I call Candyman. It's by no means a finished product, but Candyman attempts to answer these kinds of questions. So let's go to github.com. Candyman is an open source project, and you can find it at codefoster/Candyman. And if we go ahead and drill into the app.js of Candyman, you'll see that the sugar in this module is this execute remote async and execute local async. Now these are methods that, using the QPromise library, actually run a either local or remote command and return a promise. Now a promise is a way to get a placeholder that says I'll get back to you as soon as I'm done, and so we have an opportunity to execute some code whenever something is finished. So it becomes a way of handling workflow or executing asynchrony, throwing things all onto the pipeline whenever our processor has time to get to those. Now behind the scenes, the remote async function here is actually just using SSH2 client. So this is a requirement here in the Candyman library. There's a requirement for this SSH2 client, and that's how we do the remote commands. The local commands, on the other hand, are done using child process. So this is going to do the equivalent of dropping down to the console and executing a command. So if something doesn't work at your console, it's not going to work here in Candyman. So you're going to have to make sure that you have things working there. Okay, so let's go ahead and flip back to our code. Let's require Candyman, and I'm going to use a capital C because I know that with the Candyman module, I've followed a standard convention whereby the module returns not an object, but it returns a function. And it's an instantiator function. It's a class function, and so I'm going to use the convention of a capital C here. Then I'm going to create my local lowercase Candyman, and that's going to be a newly instantiated Candyman passing in some configuration. Now I've pre-written that configuration so that you don't have to watch me type once again. I'll go ahead and get that copied from another screen, and I'll paste this in. There we go. Now this is the configuration format that I chose for Candyman. I enumerate an array of target devices, and then I put some other kind of default configuration data in here. This is the user that we're going to use to log into the devices, the password that we're going to be using, unless of course we already have keys set up. What the start file for our project is, in this case ours is called app.js, and what basically this is what the folder name is going to be. We're going to call this folder TweetMonkey. And then for the target devices, we have an opportunity here to add not just one, but a lot of different devices. And this is a way that we can deploy automatically to 5 or 10 or 100 different devices and let Candyman just distribute that code to all of those for us. So that could be really interesting, especially if you want to create some sort of robotic swarms. In this case, we're just deploying to one device, that is TweetMonkey, and the host name might be an IP address, but in this case we can just use that MDNS name, and it is tweetmonkey.local. So just one device. So once I've instantiated all of this, I have the opportunity to call Candyman in any of the methods that are in Candyman. Let's go look at what kind of methods are already in Candyman. Now this is where you might want to fork the project and customize it yourself. I've just chosen what really works for me. There's one method called deploy that makes a directory in the remote on the remote device, and then it copies the app.js and package.json file. You might not use this convention of calling your file app.js. You might choose to deploy all JavaScript files. This is the way I've chosen to do it. My projects are always very simple and contain an app.js and a package.json, so that's what I want the deploy to contain. And so that's all that make up the deploy task, are those two remotely. This is a remotely executed command, and then locally I'm going to call the SCP in order to copy those files up. So that's what actually happens whenever I call the Candyman deploy. So let's go ahead and call that in here. Let's call candyman.deploy. It's that simple. Now candyman.deploy, like I mentioned, is an asynchronous function and returns a promise. The way that Gulp works is if you return a promise, then it will wait for that promise in order for this task to be complete. This is really important because if you have a lot of Gulp tasks, you want first the project to be deployed and then something else to happen and then something else to happen. And you can do that by simply returning this Candyman method, and then it will happen asynchronously. Okay, so this should be all wired up. I didn't show you the core, the default task running in Gulp. Let me go ahead and show you that. I'm going to save this. I'm going to jump back to the command line. We are at this, and oh, I actually did show you that working. I said gulp, and that called the default task. Now it's complaining about Candyman not existing, and that's fine. All we have to do is install Candyman, and that would be a dev only feature. So we're going to --save--dev. That's installed, and notice that you can see the dependencies of Candyman were installed as well. Q, the promise library, and SSH2, that library for executing commands remotely. Now let's go ahead and do gulp without any parameters, and we get running the default gulp task. And if I say gulp deploy, then I get the attempt, at least, to deploy this code out to the device. Now this has actually thrown an error. It was unable to reach that device. Let's go ahead and ping tweetmonkey.local and make sure that we're able to access that. In fact, we are. So then let's jump out to our gulp file.json, and we are configuring this with tweetmonkey.local. That looks good. So let's go ahead and try this again. Let's do a gulp deploy. And this time it's worked just fine. Not sure why it failed the first time. May have just been a timing issue, but now we've successfully copied that out. So let's SSH, actually let's go ahead and prove that this worked by in the app.js file, let's put something in here that will recognize hello world using Candyman. And then we'll go back and do a gulp deploy again. That worked again. Now let's SSH to TweetMonkey. Enter the TweetMonkey directory. That uses the project name variable that we set up in the configuration. We do have an app.js, and if I cat the app.js file, you should see hello world using Candyman. And in fact, if we ran that, of course, that's what it would console log out. But no need to do that. Now that's great to be able to simply call gulp deploy and have that entire project be deployed. But let's make it one step simple using Visual Studio. Visual Studio has a pane that can be installed in Visual Studio 2013. It's an add-on, and this pane is you can find this under View, Other Windows, and it's called the Task Runner Explorer. With Visual Studio 2015 and beyond, this is built in. If I open this Task Runner Explorer, it's going to look for the presence of gulp, the module, deployed globally. It's going to look for gulp deployed in this project, and it's going to look for this gulp file. So it's going to look for all of those things to exist. Now, once that's the case, I can come in here and click refresh, and it's going to enumerate the different tasks that I have in my gulp file.js. Default and deploy were both enumerated. So those are both here. Now I can just double click on those and run them directly, and I get to see the results of that running. Here's running the default gulp task, And here is an attempt to deploy this out to the device. Pretty slick there. We can even automate this so that we take this deploy, right click on that, and go to bindings and say, after I build, I want you to run this task. So when I do this, I get in my gulpfile.js, I get this little comment that's not going to bother anybody, but what it means to Visual Studio is I want to bind the deploy task here to the after build function. So now whenever I do a build in Visual Studio, that task is going to run and it's going to deploy my code out to the device. This whole process is obviously a little bit easier if you map your deployment method and then just have this automatically happen in Visual Studio whenever you build your project. That's what we're trying to do, is get everything streamlined and easy so we can make quick iterations, change our code, try new things, and have it sent out to the board really quickly. All right, so we've looked at automating our deployment using Visual Studio, using Gulp and Candyman to make it quick and seamless to get our code from our development environment out to our production device, and watching our IoT project, whatever it might be, actually whir into motion and do what it is that we asked it to do. All right, we've seen how to get started writing code for these system-on-a-chip devices, but we only dabbled in the IoT-specific code. I'm talking about code that turns on an LED or reads from a temperature gauge. So far, we've just been working on the coding environment and workflow options and things like that. Now, a little bit of IoT code that we have written has been pretty raw. The fact is that once you get up to the level we're at now, where we've successfully run Node on the device, you have some really powerful options for writing the actual program logic. And that's what we're going to look at next. We're going to look at the Node modules that will make your life very, very easy when you're writing apps that not only talk to the device, but also do a lot of other modern things like fetching data from the internet, creating APIs and web interfaces for the device, and a whole bunch more. I don't know about you, but I've had a good time with the content so far, but buckle up, because from here to the end of the course, each module is even more exciting than the last.